Welcome to Module 4, Lesson 1. By the end of this lesson, you will know how bias quietly distorts judgment at work, why smart professionals are still vulnerable to it, and how to spot the most career-relevant patterns before they damage a recommendation, a hiring call, or a team decision. Let's get into it. A senior manager works in a review meeting already leaned towards one explanation. The numbers are ugly. A client's complaint has escalated. One team member sounds confident, another sounds hesitant. A respected executive says, "We have seen this before." And just like that, the room starts moving. One person begins looking for confirming evidence, another gets anchored by the first number mentioned. A third starts trusting the most polished speaker. Someone else is still reacting to last week's incidents. Nobody says. We may be watching bias happen in real time. Now, think about this. That is exactly the problem. Bias almost never announces itself as bias. It arrives sounding like experience, instincts, common sense, speed, or maturity. And by the time the room realizes the conclusion was distorted, the decision is usually already made. The cost of bias is rarely immediate embarrassment. It's usually something more dangerous, bad judgment that still feels reasonable. That is why bias is career critical. You can work hard, sound sharp, and still keep making distorted calls because the distortion does not feel like an error. It feels like a good read of the situation. What this means is that the damage compounds quietly. Your recommendations become less trustworthy. Your teams mistake certainty for clarity. Politics and familiarities start quietly overpowering evidence, and you keep repeating the same judgment errors while calling them experience. That matters because the professional who earns deep trust in high stake rooms are not the ones who were never wrong. They're the ones who can see distortion forming in themselves and in the room before it hardens into a bad call. This is what drives the entire module. Bias is not a flaw that only careless people have. It is a predictable distortion in how normal people interpret reality. You do not overgrow bias by being smart. You reduce it by becoming diagnostic. Here's the important idea, and the word I want you to hold onto is systematic. Bias is not random sloppiness. It is a systematic tendency to misread, overweight, underweight, or distort information in a predictable direction. That word systematic is what makes bias career critical. It means the same pattern will keep showing up in your thinking, in hiring strategy, escalations, product decisions, until you learn to name and interpret it. Not because you're careless, but because the mind is built to move efficiently, not perfectly. Now, let me make this practical with where bias actually lives. Most professionals assume bias happens at the moment of decision, when someone makes a bad decision, but bias usually starts much earlier. It shapes what you notice first, what you ignore, what feels persuasive, what gets remembered, which explanation seems obvious, whose view sounds credible before it being tested. Once attention is distorted, interpretation follows. Once interpretation is distorted, the decision often feels completely clean. So reflect on this for a moment. Think about the last time a room reached a conclusion faster than the evidence seems to warrant. What made it feel justified? Was it the quality of the judgment or the confidence of the people making it, the familiarity of the patterns, or the seniority of who agreed first? Now compare that with what bias-aware thinking requires. It requires catching the distortion at the point of attention, before interpretation solidifies and before the conclusion feels inevitable. Here's where weaker professionals get trapped. They assume confidence equals credibility. They treat familiarity as proof. They think a strong antidote outweighs broader evidence. They assume bias belongs to other people, not to them. Now, let's build on that with the correction that matters most. Smart people are not protected from bias. They are often more vulnerable because they are better at constructing cohesive arguments for whatsoever the distortion has already decided. Here's the important idea that changes how you approach this. The fastest explanation in the room is often carrying an invisible distortion. And the more obvious a conclusion feels, the more important it is to ask what is making it feel that way. Write this down. If a conclusion feels too obvious, check which bias may be helping it feel obvious. Let's take a look at the tool. The tool for this lesson is the bias recognition flashcard set. And the point of using flashcards is to train recognition, not just vocabulary. Knowing the name of bias is not the skill. Catching it forming in a live meeting is the skill. For each bias, your workbook card answers 4 things. What it sounds like in a meeting, what damage it causes, and what one question interrupts it. Here are 12 career critical bias. I will give you each one in plain language, no jargons, no textbook definition. What you need is to hear them and think, yes, I have been in that room. Confirmation bias. You look for evidence that fits what you already believe and discount what does not. Anchor bias. The first number or claim in the room sets the reference point and everything else gets evaluated relative to it. Halo effect. Someone is impressive in one visible area, so the room assumes they must be strong everywhere. Recency bias. Whatsoever happened most recently gets the most weight regardless of how representative it is. Availability bias. What is easiest to recall feels most important. Vivid stories, recent incidents, memorable failures. Authority bias. A senior person speaks and the room quietly adjusts its view to match. Overconfidence. The strength of someone's certainty gets mistaken for the strength of the evidence behind it. Sunk cost fallacy. Past investment makes a decision feel harder to reverse than it actually should be. Groupthink. The room values harmony and alignment over honest disagreement, and dissent becomes socially expensive. Loss of aversion. The fear of losing something creates stronger pull than the equivalent potential gain. Overcome bias. A decision gets judged by what happened, not by whether the reasoning at the time was sound. Framing effect. The same information presented differently produces different choices, even when the substance is identical. Now let's build on that with one observation that ties all 12 together. None of these arrived labeled. They arrived sounding like experience, caution, boldness, consensus, or common sense. The skill is not memorized on the list. The skill is developing an ear for the moment when a conclusion is moving faster than the evidence. Let me give you an example. A fintech leadership team is deciding whether to promote a charismatic business lead into a larger commercial role. On paper, the candidate looks strong. Strong presence, excellent relationship, confidence in executive rooms. The CEO likes him. 2 visible wins happened recently. Nobody wants to slow the momentum. Now, think about this. Look at how many bias quietly stack in the room like this. Halo effect. Because he's impressive in one visible area, the room assumes he must be strong in others too. Recency bias. The last 2 wins are still fresh, so older performance inconsistency gets less attention. Authority bias. Once the CEO sounds positive, other people start editing their reservation rather than voicing them. Confirmation bias. Supporters begin collecting reasons he fits the bigger role, not reasons he may struggle. Availability bias. Vivid success stories are easier to recall than the quieter signs of execution weakness. So the success stories do more work in the room than they should. That matters because no one in this room has to be foolish for the judgment to become distorted. The candidates may genuinely be talented. The issue is not whether he has strength. The issue is whether the room is evaluating the next role clearly, or whether admiration, recent wins, and executive presence are doing too much of the work. Now, here's the important idea. Watch what the stronger intervention looks like. It is not "you're all biased." That creates defensiveness and goes nowhere. It is Before we lock this in, let's separate what is impressive from what is actually predictive of success in a bigger role. Which evidence here tells us specifically about performance at that level? That one question weakens halo. It weakens confirmation bias. It weakens authority pull. It moves the discussion from admiration to evidence. And notice what that question does not do. It does not slow the room down with a lecture on cognitive psychology. It changes what the room is evaluating. It is the real skill. Bias recognition is not about sounding skeptical. It's about asking the question that makes distorted thinking harder to sustain. Let's take a moment to reflect on this. Think of your recent decision from work. Write 5 short lines. What conclusion the room favored? Which 2 biases were most likely shaping it? What evidence was overweighing? What evidence was underweighing? And what question could have interrupted the pattern earlier? Do not pick a safe example. Pick the real one. Your workbook has the full set of 12 bias recognition flashcards, each with what the bias sounds like in a meeting, the damage it causes, and the specific questions that interrupts it. Walk through the cards after this lesson and identify the 2 or 3 that shows up most in your environment. Here's what I need you to carry along. Bias hides itself inside what feels reasonable. The job is not to eliminate instincts, it's to diagnose the distortion before you trust the conclusion. Your next action step for this lesson is any meaningful meetings you're in, look for the moment where the room starts sounding unusually certain, unusually attached to the first explanation, and unusually aligned along one person's view. That is your signal. Ask one question. What evidence are we overweighing here, and what may be getting too little attention? Notice whether the room slows down. Notice whether new evidence appears. Notice whether the conclusion becomes more honest, not because you sounded more forceful, but because you asked a better question at the right moment. That is what this model is building. See you in lesson 2.